Okay, now I welcome the Prime Minister whenever you are ready.
Great. I'll be start. Give me 1 minute. Yes, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Beginning with our policy, I'd first like to clarify where our policy applies. It applies in cases where a student is facing challenges which are only based on them being a minority, thus things they cannot control. This would look like a student being unnecessarily discriminated against by the teacher, bullied for their race, which cause studying to be done at a hindered rate and at a hindered ability. And all these things are unjust, as I will go on to prove. Thus, in these cases, if the school is doing nothing to stop such an issue, then the teacher is, according to us, warranted and should actually take action against them in the form of inflating rates. Now, what does this look like? This looks like believable inflation. So rather, for example, moving it from an A to an A star, which makes it much more believable and makes it much less likely for you to get caught. Now, I want to break down what the actor here, the teacher, is actually risking. They're only risking a very small chance of them being caught because of the simple fact that these type of changes are not very detectable. The administration cannot small changes in grades from an A to an A star. Thus, the teacher is risking something which is very low in terms of probability, which is them being caught. But what they're achieving is the betterment of a student's career in terms of academics. What they're achieving is a student possibly reaching a better college and having a changed life trajectory in our best case, but at the very least, having a much better life in school, which we believe for the few amount of risks they take is actually worth it. Now, before I move on to our positive case, I'll take your POI.
Within the status quo, where children are directly discriminated because of their race, is a need that is very, very limited. That only happens in a very small minutia of circumstances. How do you engage with this on your side of the house when most children aren't treated like this? They're treated very, very fairly within status quo.
We believe that is simply something which is false. If you were knowledgeable about this issue, you'd realize the fact that in places like the Bronx, in places even in Pakistan, students face unfair bullying, which the school does nothing against. Students face unwarranted discrimination against themselves by the teacher simply because of the way they look and because of preconceived notions by the teacher. So this is something that is simply, in my mind, a problem of them not having enough knowledge to know the extreme problems caused by this issue. And we believe that it is present enough for us to take action against it. Now, firstly, why is this morally needed and morally a good thing? This is where the principle of fairness applies, which is basically the idea that one must uphold fairness when unjust disadvantages are being given to people. Why is this true? Because everyone, irrespective of their color, and this is something I believe both sides and everyone in general should and does recognize, that everyone, irrespective of their color or race, deserves equal rights. At the point when these people are not given these equal rights, there is a problem to fix because they're being unjustly discriminated against. Now, I'm going to go on to prove to you how they are actually disadvantaged and what this looks like and why this is true. The student does not choose what household they are born in. Rather, they are simply born in a household due to the lottery nature of birth. Thus, it is unjust for you to discriminate against them on the basis of ethnicity they're from. These kids that we're talking about face bullying for being a minority. In many cases, teachers even discriminate against them. And this is the type of unfair. When all these unfair disadvantages are there, they cause a lot. It is made much harder for the student to study due to their challenges of mental health, like stress, low self-esteem. And this, on top of the natural issues a student faces, like financial issues of the family, make it unfair for them to compete against the white student or the student that is not being discriminated against. In the event that this is true, we believe that the teacher has a responsibility, or not actually a responsibility or an obligation, but it is good for the teacher, and it is on our side supported and good and morally upright for the teacher to inflate their marks and even out the playing field, because the type of negative discrimination they're facing can only be combated with positive discrimination done by the teacher in the point in time, as we said before, when the school admin is doing nothing to combat this. Now, I would like to reiterate the fact that this applies only when the people in power are doing nothing to make sure the rights are ensured, and thus the teacher is the only one left to carry this out. We are not saying, again, that this is an obligation on the part of the teacher. Not every teacher needs to do this. But what we're saying is that this is just a case of moral uprightness and moral goodness, which needs to be appreciated in that sense and not condemned. This is like the oppressed liberals, which are fighting for their own rights in BLM, also supporting the Palestinians. Not an obligation, but very good. And we should look towards this and encourage this. There's also the fact that other than moral aspects, this is something which is practically going to help the fight against discrimination. At the very least, this is going to do it in a minute yet significant way. But at the best, it is going to do it in a very, very recognizable and significant way. Why is this true? Because one of the reasons the issue of discrimination is still persisting is because many of these challenged communities have a really recognizable power deficit. The main reason this is because most of the kids that belong to these communities don't excel in terms of the socio-economic ladder. Most of these people do not go to college due to these societal challenges that I've mentioned and other societal challenges associated with this. Now, what this looks like is a lot of the children in the Bronx not opting for college simply because of the challenges they face. When we start helping them as such, fixing the issues that they face in school and fixing the identity issues they have due to the issues they face in school, they have a much higher chance of getting into better higher education, but also identifying themselves as someone that would opt for this. What does this mean? There's this concept in sociology that I'm not going to touch on, which is that once a teacher starts to treat students in a way based on their grades, start to treat them as less intelligent than others, the student automatically assumes this identity. This is because of the fact that at the point in time the student is the age the student is existing at is one where they're incredibly malleable and vulnerable. When you even start this minute policy of appreciating the student, which we believe is very probable for a teacher that is carrying out our actions or our proposed action to do, when the teacher is going to be nice to the student and going to carry out this positive discrimination, they're going to support the student being able to form a positive identity about themselves. This is going to make them much more likely to view themselves as someone that goes off to college. But more than that, this is just naturally in every case going to improve their grades, which is going to improve their chances of getting into a good college. What this is going to do is that this is going to help the community have more power, more representation, because more of these people are going to enter important facilities like business, like politics. At their best, we're going to produce more politicians from these challenged communities, more businessmen, more millionaires from these challenged communities. But at our worst, we're simply going to produce more members of their movements. This is true because most of these liberal movements have educated people. This is true because statistically speaking, woke movements mainly have educated Ivy League students leading them and just educated people in general. When we produce more educated people from these communities, we increase the amount of support these movements have. We increase the amount of people supporting these movements, and thus we at our least give these movements a higher chance of achieving their goals. But at our best, we're going to produce more politicians and millionaires for the world. Now, from these communities, giving them a higher chance of fixing their issues. Why is this likely? I'm going to reiterate this just for clarity reasons. The fact that they're going to have better applications because of them having better grades, but also because of the better identity that I have just mentioned. And now I'd like to just give you a concluding summarization of what we just proved to you. We proved to you the fact that morally speaking, they are good for doing this because they are carrying out something that is going to help against discrimination and help increase the chances of a student succeeding in a place where they were unjustly hampered. Now, they are also going to be fighting against discrimination in a least way, just strengthening movements, but at the best, making more millions of politicians. And they do this all while risking something very little, which is the minute chance that they might get caught and have a warning or two given by the administration. At the point in time where they achieve all these things, proud to.
Thank you so much for this speech, First Speaker of Opposition, whenever you're ready.
Can I get 30 seconds?
First speaker of opposition.
Am I good to go? Just I will be starting my speech in three. Yeah, एक और minute. Sorry for the disturbance. I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. I am a black woman that's teaching in a school. I can award someone extra marks, but I won't do that. Why? Because I know that I'm inherently harming other white students. I have been discriminated my entire life. I don't want those white students to be discriminated as well. Proud to post. But then some ideas they had here. Firstly, they're framing. They tell you that these children are discriminated because of the race. There's stuff like unfair bullying. I think this is very unfair framing. Why? Because I think this kind of incidents only happens a one in a million chance. This is to say that by their own framing, in areas like the Bronx, there are students that are black like you. There are other black teachers that do reparations. I have two ideas. Firstly, I think this is based on getting infantilization. This is to say that you have other white children like you who were born there. This is to say that if a black student was given 65% by a teacher and a white student was given 80%, yet this specific teacher gives him an 85%. I think that's very unfair that white student is also then discriminated along with you. I don't think you're giving reparations to everyone. But then there's a third idea on how a student needs this validation. This student is discriminated and thus needs validation. I think I have two responses. Firstly, I think inflating scores is inherently an unfair way of giving people validation. This is to say, you make them think that they're not working hard and this is not enough to work. This is to say that you're telling these white students, generally telling them that whatever they're doing is wrong. They haven't been working hard, even though they have been doing their entire life. But then, secondly, I think there are much better ways and better alternatives that we have on our side with the ways we can help these students. This is to say, like these black teachers giving extra help to these students, giving extra tuition, and generally encourage them that they can work in their life. But their last idea about how these students face a lot of challenges and unnecessarily get discriminated because I think there's still stuff like believable change. This is to say that in past, sure, these are persecuted, but now there has been a shift in trend. So the trend has been changed, and now people, instead of being persecuted like they were before, these persecutions have been lowered. People are trying to be treated equally. I think you need to work on with life. But then a few lines, but then a few characteristics for you. What does artificial infiltration look like? I think firstly, it looks like you're going behind everyone's back. This is to say you're going behind the school's back. You're going behind every student's back, especially those white students. Secondly, you're secretly changing these marks for the students. For example, you're making changing from 80 to 90%. This going from an A to an A star, from you being an average student to being the best student in the class. This is to say the black teacher is rewarding that black student specifically. But what is racial or these minorities then look like? I think these minorities have been persecuted their entire lives, but there has been a change in trends where these minorities are now treated equally by the social majority of white people that exist. But what's the framing for this debate? I think firstly, this teacher is from an ethnic and social minority. This is to say that she still had gotten some education. This is to say that she's been working her entire life to get a job in the first place. Now that she's become a teacher, she wants to climb the socioeconomic ladder. But then secondly, I think she's, I think there in the school there are other students from marginalized communities. I think these students still have been performing really, really well. I think this debate is centered on that specific one or two children that don't score well within schools. But then lastly, what does this actor look like? I think it's two things. Firstly, this actor is from a repressed minority. This is to say that you've already dealt with discrimination within your life and you know how bad it feels to be alienated or discriminated. But then secondly, I think you also don't want any other kid to be discriminated just because of their color, because you already know how it feels to be alienated. But then my first argument on meritocracy and the responsibility that you feel as a teacher. Think that because you've been publicly humiliated your entire life because of your skin color and you're made fun of because of the community you belong to. I think you've been infantilized your entire life. This is because of the basis of skin color that you have. You now know what it feels to be alienated. I think with all of this, the teacher now feels an inherent responsibility towards the students. What does this responsibility then look like? I think that this responsibility is just the teacher feeling to impart fair education on the students. Fair education in the sense of her awarding fair marks, fair scores to every student. Then secondly, why do we think this is true? I think because this person is from marginalized background, they feel very strongly about meritocracy. Where does this principle of meritocracy then get into them, and why do they know it? I think it comes from the idea that we humans are all intellectually capable. This is you must all be held by the same standards. A black and a white sky must be judged on the same metric. Why do we think the actor then cares for this? I think that this actor really cares for this because he's been discriminated his entire life. Just because it was a poor black person, he was compared to a white black person and then discriminated. I think this goes against the principles of meritocracy, and he knows what meritocracy in these cases look like. How does this whole obligation on ourselves? I think it's two different things. Firstly, we think as a teacher, this actor understands that we have signed contracts. This is to say, contract with the school that you will judge all students equally, that you are obligated to give fair scores. But then secondly, I also think you've been discriminated for so long. You don't want to discriminate another white child. You want to ensure that both of these students get equal scores, not the black child because the white child having a fair skin complexion. And what are the principal impacts of this? I think it's two different impacts. Firstly, you compromising on other students' efforts because you don't want to reward the dignity of marks. For example, if white student has worked a lot, he's worked an entire month for examinations and then he get 80%. But the black student instead did not study, he got a 65%, but then the teacher artificially changed it for the black kid to be 85%. I think you then stop over the white kid. But then secondly, we also compromise on these very students' education. This is to say that a lot of these students are from marginalized communities that they work very hard and score well. We think you disadvantage those black kids as well by inflating the scores of that specific one or two individuals on which this debate around. So at that point in time, we think you as an actor should never take a decision because you're appropriating some harms you had on yourself for discrimination onto these kids. But then a second argument of how you will get up these children for failures in their lines at birth. You as an actor, you make sure that this position you were once in the position that these kids are. So you seeing them struggle in their lives will disproportionately make you feel harmed both emotionally and mentally. You will feel very attached to these kids. You will feel connected to these kids because you also remember yourself memorically to be like that. This is to say that you feel now very close to these kids. But there are two tiers here. Firstly, on external testing. Why I think you really harm these students when you start using this connection to help them. This is to say that we think that stuff like education is based on so many different metrics. This looks like different examinations, like the CIE examinations or STATs. This is to say that these tests are very standardized and are strictly on merit. What happens at prop when you artificially inflate these student scores is that now you feel that the very little work you've put in your entire life will also work in these external testing. And it's right. So to say you become very complacent, and when times come for you to give these external tests, you don't score that much, and your scores don't reflect the scores you get in your entire life. I think this specific person or this kid is then inherently harmed because A, these scores are permanent, but B, even if he wants to change those, he doesn't have the money because he's from that minority. Tier two on how this person thinks of himself as a child prodigy. We think what happens with these with the stats that these kids start thinking very highly of themselves because they've been rewarded and they've been scoring so much. I think they then put very minimal effort in their tests and scores they want. This is to say, since because they're rewarded at such a young age, they start thinking of them as some prodigies. But what do we think happens? I think when these children then are introduced to very competitive environments, they become very complacent. For example, you're then not competing on assignments to get to universities, you end up failing, you drop dropping high school, etc. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, I think when these kids move to very professional lines, they carry this complacent work ethics with them and they don't get good jobs. Why? Because this complacent ethics work change them into their work ethics, don't get good jobs, and they continue this cycle of poverty within marginalized communities. But then secondly, I think these kids will get grew resentment to that specific actor. That teacher will face resentment because the students will blame on that teacher. But for other side, proving to you why that principal impacts because of this proud to pose. Very good.
Thank you so much for that speech. Second proposition speaker, whenever you are ready.
Can I start? The problem with side opposition in this debate is that they're arguing on the very non stakeholder of the white child being oppressed, because according to their understanding of the motion, this motion A only exists in the US and B exists in a US in which all sorts of discrimination are completely gone, and it only happens in a very small minority of cases. I think this is generally just very untrue at the point in when you do generally recognize that these issues exist in society. You still have the Black Lives Matter movement. You still have affirmative action in a lot of universities and educational institutions. You still have a lot of methods to cope with this discrimination in the first place. At the point when these movements are still extremely active and they still are advocating for Black rights and minority ethnic rights in general, I don't necessarily see why this issue doesn't exist in the status quo. But then let's refute their ideas on an idea to idea basis before I move on to my own positive extension in regards to role models. We told you, we told you at first that the idea of fairness here is extremely important, where we told you that everyone deserves an equal playing field. And here's the problem here. You recognize that not everyone is on an equal playing field because these Black people are generally, because these ethnic minorities are generally disadvantaged in the status quo. You recognize that a lot of other teachers do generally place labels on these Black people, on these people. They lack resources as a whole because they're generally discriminated in society, and also they're generally bullied for being a different color, for example. And as a result of that, they're unable to work as well as they might be able to, on our side of the house in the first place. At the point when we're carrying out positive discrimination, which is basically based on the same principle that affirmative action is, which is something that exists in the status quo, at that point in time, what we're doing is we're basically giving them a greater opportunity and we're bringing them up to an equal playing field, which didn't exist prior to this in the first place by inflating the scores as a whole. But then our second argument was about how since the cycle of poverty will also generally be broken, since these people know that since these people know that there is a chance for them to break out of the cycle of poverty, they will start to work harder. And since they generally will have better grades, they are more likely to get into institutions for higher education in the first place. They had a couple of responses here. Firstly, they said on a comparative that harming white students is a lot worse and that you're discriminating against them. Firstly, we already told you that these people basically do generally have a lot more opportunity than these ethnic minorities in the status quo, and that they are on a higher playing field in comparison to these ethnic minorities, which is why we need to uplift these ethnic minorities. But secondly, generally, you recognize that in society, white people are the elites. In the US, it is basically dominated by the elites in the first place. There's very few Black people in power in the first place. For example, Obama was elected 20 years ago, and a lot of the presidents in the past have generally been white in the first place. But then secondly, they argue that very few people generally face discrimination. And I've already generally dealt with this, but there do still exist a lot of movements on the basis of this discrimination, which proves that discrimination still generally is an extremely big issue in society. And even if we can see that it isn't an issue in the US, there are still a lot of other countries where this issue does generally exist in the first place. But then a couple of their responses here were the first of their responses was that inflating is generally bad because since white people are working extremely hard, you're basically disadvantaging them and you're basically not you're basically like harming them in the first place. Firstly, it's important to understand that we're not necessarily like harming white people by doing this in the first place. That is to say that we're not down marking them. We're giving them like just the normal marking in the first place. We're just up inflating the marking of the ethnic minorities as a whole. But then secondly, they also generally do fail to understand our principle of fairness on our side, which was that you need to bring them up to equal playing field. And why does their alternative of tuition not necessarily work here? Because the problem here is that you're placing a lot of labels on the student in the first place, as a result of which they don't necessarily have the will to work. That is to say, a lot of other teachers place labels on these students and deem them as people who are not necessarily going to do work. And as a result of that, they buy into this label because they generally are impressionable at this stage. And as a result, they stop doing work in the first place. But then secondly, their entire analysis behind why it's so bad to like discriminate against white people as like as a teacher from an ethnic minority is because these ethnic minorities know how bad it generally feels to be alienated, and therefore they in their education. But the problem with this is that they don't really recognize their last idea here in regards to like was about how also disadvantaging other black students. Firstly, happens in a minority of cases. Secondly, they didn't prove to us at the point when they're improving the perception of these ethnic minorities in society as a whole by improving their grades. I think that these people also generally have more credibility in like the educational system as a whole. But then their last argument about how, which actually does cater to these ethnic minorities to their credit, they argued that these people will become believe they'd actually be able to attain good grades in the first place. What is complacency? Complacency is something that happens when you've had overwhelming amounts of success for an extremely long amount of time. That is to say, since you've been so successful, you believe you don't need to necessarily work as hard. And as a result of that, you stop necessarily doing this amount of work in the first place. It's important to understand that this principle doesn't necessarily apply here because we told you at first that this is only a very small amount of inflation. For example, if someone got a B, we might inflate that to an A, but if someone like got a U, we're not going to inflate that to an A star because that's generally not that reasonable in the first place. But secondly, what they don't necessarily recognize here is that in order to maintain the reputation person has got getting better grades, they will generally try to work harder, which is a counter mechanism to complacency in the first place. Before I move on to my own positive extension, if I'll take that point.
If your idea is that white children will resent black children in our side of the house, won't they do the same when they see these people that are other from them suddenly doing very, very good just because a black teacher came into the classroom and now a group of them is starting to magically get better marks than them?
Okay, so firstly, our idea was not about how white people are going to feel resentment towards we didn't generally say. But then secondly, the reason they won't feel resentment towards black children is because we're uplifting them from a lower playing field. That is to say, they were getting worse grades than the average, and we're just uplifting them to the same level as a whole. We're not necessarily saying that we're going to like push them to the top of the class, which is an extreme characterization and something we generally fail to engage with is with our reasonable characterization in the first place. But then like onto my own positive extension about how since you're a role model to these children, they generally do have a duty to uphold their aspirations via equitably inflating these grades to bring them to an equal playing field. What you need to understand here is that these ethnic minorities find it extremely difficult to succeed within these educational structures because they have labels based on them and they're still oppressed in other aspects of society. For example, they might not have as many resources at home to as the white children, and as a result of that, they won't be able to afford things like tuition, and they won't be able to become as successful as them in the first place. So in order to uplift them from that equal playing field, you need to give them resources in the first six. We break out of the general cycle of poverty is by at the point when they have better grades in general, their perception in society also generally improves, but they also have the ability to generally get better jobs and get into higher educational institutions in the first six, which leads to not only their perception in society improving, but they also make it a further past like institutional barriers that generally exist in society, which allows them to further advance in society as a whole, which allows you to break out of the cycle of poverty since you're actually breaking past this in the first place. Since I frequently why they're basically arguing on the basis of an extremely bad stakeholder in the first place, how they're not actually engaging with our arguments, and about how we're generally like carrying out the more moral standpoint. I think that we clearly take this to.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now we invite upon the second member of opposition.
Am I good to start? I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let me immediately recharacterize to you what this motion is and what's the conception of this debate. This debate is never in this house would as the state do something. This is in this house would as a teacher from a marginalized community who has faced discrimination all their lives do something and take this action. At that point in time, panel, I think proposition's argumentation falls flat because I'll show to you through my speech that they're arguing for generally what the world wants, not what an actor wants, and then actually what that actor will do. Regardless of that, let's move on to my positive extension to our case and something that underpins the entirety of what proposition is arguing. This idea on like everything, every issue within this debate is hinged upon this idea on the action being low risk for this teacher in the first place. Both of our sides need to realize that the teacher in and of itself is the most important action in this debate, actor within this debate. So action really low risk for this vulnerable teacher. Firstly, I think no, it's not. Why so? Because this is a person of color. This is or in the alternate framing for this debate, this is a person a lowest segment of society when it comes to economically looking at society from afar. So this means then for this person structurally, it's very hard to get jobs because you face a lot of racism, you face a lot of sexism, you face a lot of classism. So in the first place, their access to jobs within society in and of itself is very limited. So they're very lucky to get jobs in it as a teacher within out to get them. But secondly, then this idea on why people will not notice, I think proposition is arguing a very weird metric here. I think this debate generally, and what we've characterized to you from first, is this it's about 2 to 3 kids in class from the similar backgrounds. Why do we think this is true? Because we think there are people from black communities, children from black communities, and children from generally poor communities as well, who are generally also doing really well within the classroom. There is a nuance here. They aren't all monoliths who are doing. Then it's about those within a classroom. Then they're doing horribly at that doing horribly within that class. I think at that point in time when you have a member from a class similar to these people come into the teaching faculty and immediately see that these children scores, even if they are going from below average to average, which is to say they go from 15 marks per assignment to 15 marks per, those 2 to 3 children who come from the same place in society are suddenly inhibiting this change very suddenly and very immediately and in any sense. At that point in time, it's easy for other children to notice this action happening at that at that point in time. And so then what happens then? I think at that point in time, these children then go out and tell on you to the school management. At that point in time, you can get fired. It's difficult to understand within this debate panel because it's very hard for you to get a job already. But secondly, it will become harder for you to get a job again because you ability. Secondly, then these children will also feel resentful because when you've been fired from their school, these black children that you were helping by artificially inflating their scores will sink back to the below average marks that they were getting before. So they'll feel resent towards you, or at least resent to the next teacher that comes in your stead. Fourthly, then I think this is also harmful in projecting stereotypes within status quo because already for the large part of society, marginalized communities are thought to be unfair. They're already thought that they're getting affirmative action, etc., and are already reaping unfair awards within society. At that point in time, when these children, other children, find out that these children were being unfairly advantaged in this way, that's likely to then propagate very harmful stereotypes, such as these people being cheats in and of themselves, these people being less intellectually capable in and of themselves. And for all of these reasons, panel, I think very in the first place, and it's never in the best interest of this actor to take that action in the first place. At that point in time, propositions need and their end goal falls flat. But then also moving on to the principal clash within this debate, this idea on reparations. Proposition's idea is based on the lottery of birth. Since black child isn't born to a privileged family, they should get equity. But I think firstly, it's not white child's fault they were born into a family just because of the idea of lottery of birth that you use on your side of the house. They were also they are also being disproportionately harmed because they were born into a family that was out of their control. At that point in time, when they work extremely hard to get 80 marks and you're pumping up a black child from 60 to 80, at that point in time, that is inherently disadvantageous to them. Secondly, then, my principle on education and the right to education being universal because of the bigger principle within this their principle. Why though? Because we can simply co-opt their idea on reparation. I think you get better reparation on tests that you have prepared for faithfully because you under actual capability and the way you've prepared for these tests, you're able to get better scores. You're then also able to that all time I think you get you give these people better reparation if that is propositions and goal within this debate. Still, then I think the right to education just on a number basis is much better than the right that they're talking about here, because black children or children from poor communities are very less numerically, whereas the vast number of children we will benefit with the fair education to you on outside the house as a principle is much more and weighs comparatively over their ideas on this principle. Secondly, then, their idea an inherent contradiction within proposition speech here. Action already existing for this. Exactly. That's the point. Methods for activity for these people already exist within society. The debate then is, would you as a black teacher then give a child an inherent disadvantage when it's already not needed, when you could help them in much better ways and much more fulfilling ways by giving them extra tuition so that they can hail from benefits of affirmative action within status quo in the first place, so that they don't feel resentful against you in the first at the end of the day when they find out that all of their scores were actually artificially inflamed. At that point in time, I think we take this debate, but then also their last clash with us on the idea that this white people aren't vulnerable, so we need to give them an even playing field. I think the actor does not care about that. The actor cares about protecting life and thought to be intellectually less capable. They don't want to appropriate that same harm to by artificially inflating their scores, because that's inherently infantilizing. And secondly, we also don't want to disadvantage white children just because they are white, because of the color of their skin, something that happened to this very vulnerable actor within status quo for the longest time ever. But lastly, on this practical, I think we break the cycle of poverty much better on our side of the house, because these children do much better on external tests, all of the reasons that Ahmed Shiraz has given you. Secondly, we also gave you a very important idea on how you like bring a child, you make all of the harms of treating children as child prodigies into the mix. Because let's reframe this debate for a bit. Let's say you're a person, you're a teacher of, like, let's say second to third graders. At that point in time, when you artificially reward these children so they're getting 100%, 90%, 80% repeatedly, they think that it's fine because they get complacent. At that point in time, when they grow older, they're not willing to work hard when the environment gets more competitive. They're left behind at the end of the day, when these skills also transfer into their life at work, and then they become complacent at work because they have no work ethics. At that point in time, panel, you take away all of this vulnerable communities' chances at success. And for all of these reasons, panel, we take this debate very.
Thank you for that speech. Third Speaker of Government, whenever you are ready.
Okay, am I visible and audible? Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm sure you've all seen the meme of the photo of equity versus equality, where you have 3 people standing in front of the baseball field with stools, and you recognize that the correct thing to do is to give 2 stools to the short person and no stools to the tall person, so everyone can see the baseball field equally. We think the fair and the correct thing to do is to give and make sure equity exists in our world, rather than giving people resources that don't require it and only giving resources to those who actually need it. One major clarification before I get to the 2 main issues. Firstly, notice how both of the argumentation of teachers potentially being fired because of racism and black teachers facing racism in the past, which is why they care about white children, is contradictory to their response to us that, oh, but racism doesn't exist in society. All their arguments are contingent on the fact that racism or some sort of discrimination does exist to minorities. Therefore, I don't think they can argue these two contradicting ideas at once. But then, firstly, on the principle. And over here, they have one idea of meritocracy, where the teacher faces inequality, thus you should care about like white children. Three responses here. Firstly, I think when they run this argumentation, this proves to us very easily that the teacher does care about every single child. As so far as we can tell you the teacher does care about these children, then later attacks of, oh, but then why will the teacher have to do this, or why the teacher care to the black kid becomes significantly less powerful. But secondly, meritocracy only exists if everyone's on the same playing field, i.e. meritocracy will only exist if everyone has the same access to resources and it is fair for everyone to begin with. For example, meritocracy in a cricket match would only exist if if both teams are playing with a hard ball, not if one team is playing with a tennis ball and one team is playing with a hard ball. I.e., meritocracy can only exist when both of them are on the same playing field. This is where our context becomes extremely important, because we tell you three things here. We tell you, firstly, the majority of situations, African American children are significantly more disadvantaged compared to white children. Why? Because of socio-economic situations, i.e., within household, they oftentimes don't have access to the same amount of resources. Inherently, because they was historically discriminated. This is the entire race and ethnicity of people who were carried over in the 1800s during the time of slavery, and now they've been forced into poor socio-economic situations where they're significantly less privileged compared to their counterparts. Secondly, and this is very important, majority of situations, African American kids often face issues, for example, of having absent parents at home, i.e. more than half of all African American children only have single parents raising them, meaning the resources available as to they have significantly few parents being able to help them in this situation. But thirdly, we think in the majority of situations, African American children generally face racism in society, i.e. there are some subconscious biases or there's some narrative that exists that we should always give a white person a job because better, or B, there might be narratives like they're more productive, etc. We think then meritocracy only exists if there's a fair playing field. We think there's no fair playing field in this world. But thirdly, we think that if we don't think the African American kid, the African American teacher will care about this white kid as much as the black kid. Why? Because we think communities always exist among these minority groups where they only care about a certain subsect in their community more. I.e., for example, within the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ plus teachers might be much more sympathetic to an LGBTQ student living in a conservative society. That is to say, this idea of community and being sympathetic still exists. Our idea was never engaged with. And this directly clashes where I told you about this entire idea of, again, the reasons I listed earlier as to why it's not fair. They only picked up responses from their own principal argumentation as trying to rebut. We got no actual direct engagement here. We think then on the principle, the comparative is very their principle, which is catering to a group which is already fine in the status quo. It's catering to a group that has historically seen no oppression. It is catering to a group that is in power, and most subsets of power are catering to that group. It is catering to a group which the law already favors. On our world, where a group that has been historically discriminated, that almost no one has cared about, that almost no one has given actual leeway, is being catered to. We think on a principle level, intuitively, and I think generally, on the vulnerability of stakeholder, we're much more vulnerable. Therefore, on the comparative, on the way up, we're much more important here. But then on the practical clash as to where African American students are better off and the teachers better off, they say three things here. The first, and this is a mechanism, and this is the only way they're trying to prove negative harms in our world, is that, oh, but these children will fail in external testing, which they push a lot at first and second. We already respond at second that, again, we're not going to give these kids overwhelming success, i.e. these kids won't get complacent because they see we'll probably give them, i.e. probably a small increase of success, because it's also in the teacher's incentive to make sure these kids get as far as possible. The teacher themselves recognize that if you give this kid an insane amount of success, very quickly the kid will get complacent. It's in teacher's interest then for this kid to go as far as possible because of the previous mentioned idea of community. Therefore, we think the teacher is likely to give this child some sort of minimum some success to tell the child you're not a failure. In sociology and O levels, you literally have this entire concept of how if the teacher stereotypes a kid and tells the kid they're not as good, the kid will start to internalize this. We think that the child will work much harder, and this is our mechanism. But we think thirdly, let's say I concede to this, even if they fail this, comparatively you are still better. Why? In the majority of situations, for example, in like the American high school, where they try to argue this debate, SAT is not the only thing that matters. Your current and school grades also matter. Meaning, just on the simple comparative, we think even if you do fail, I think in both worlds, then you might as well fail this SAT test. At least in our world, then you're getting some minimal or like some benefit and like some better chance to maybe getting a community college or some benefits. Before I continue to destroy their case, any POIs?
Idea on meritocracy is that this actor cares about the principle of meritocracy, not that the state should care about this principle of meritocracy. As long as the actor does not care about the principle you're promoting on your side of the house, why would they ever carry that out?
Number one, you're asserting this. You're giving me no reason not to believe the actor cares about fairness. Secondly, people do generally care about fairness. We told you fairness is linked to meritocracy. And thirdly, I told you this entire idea of communities where generally much more linked to the community around, therefore you're likely to care about this. Secondly, then, and this is their push, that teacher of color will face a lot of discrimination and can be kicked out of society. A couple of responses. Firstly, we think you generally value the situation or the way teachers are in society, i.e., in places like America, where you have a reduction in the amount of teachers available, we don't think you're going to readily start firing teachers because they might increase a grade from a B to an A. At most, and even if they are somehow caught, you might get a reprimandal. But secondly, we think this is very hard to notice. It could look like things like a bit more lenient marking in our world. It can look like minimum improvements. They're taking our case to an extreme where somehow the kid goes from a U to an A star. We told you this very clearly in our policy. But then, our ideas here, and this is where our practical is extremely important. We tell you that these African American kids will be stuck in cycles of poverty in their world because poor socio-economic situations exist. For reasons: absent parents, lack of resources, oftentimes worse previous teachers or worse study material available, and fourthly, societal issues surrounding that community. For example, it looks like certain communities being involved with drug abuse. It looks like certain communities being forced into like crime, etc. And then we think that what that means is, because you have issues like absent parents, where parents are working overtime just to support their family, your socioeconomic situations and the attention the child gets is significantly less, meaning they perform much worse in school. So this is where the teacher gets significantly better, because the teacher cares generally about community because they're from that community. Once they help these children, they're able to give this child more hope. Because look at this from the child's perspective. When you're on a daily basis coming home to a dysfunctional household, and in school you're being told you're a failure, you're never going to succeed. In our world, in your school, at least you're being told you have some marginal success, meaning you have the idea to work harder. People often give up when they think there's no path to success in their world. In our world, there's some path to success that you think you can succeed in some metric. For all those reasons, I think on the principle of fairness and generally on the practical endpoint, and because we deal with a more vulnerable stakeholder, I think it's a very clean ISL win.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now I invite upon opposition vote.
Can I please have a minute?
Sure.
Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, at the entire case of proposition, all I'm seeing is that, they are proposing that, these students, they're currently facing discrimination, so let the teacher artificially inflate their grades so that these students are at the stake of facing discrimination or doing discrimination not only to all the other students in the classroom, but are also creating problems within their own communities. Therefore, they are putting this all under the stake, just under the label of moral uprightness of a teacher, which is not something that they're achieving at their end, and is not something which the teacher would want to do in the first place. But then secondly, their end goal is that the kid would work harder if you encourage this, if you actually artificially inflate their grades. However, there are much better ways to do so, which have already provided you with the alternatives to do so. A being that you can give that student extra free tuition at the end of the day, which is better because the student feels like someone is caring about them, someone wants them to be successful in the future, and you can also give them more extra extension there, and also give positive encouragement generally, which is better because it is actively showing to kids that you believe in them, assuming that someone's believe in them as an exam result reflects good results. This is how this can be improved. These are the alternatives that we do provide you in the debate, and this is not something that they're catering to on their end or actually engaging at all on our end as well. But then they also try to put this unfair burden at opposition that, if you're talking about the white child, they are the most irrelevant stakeholder, and this is not something that is to be discussed in the debate. However, they're not realizing that when we're talking about the white child feeling discriminated is to just reflect upon the comparison that when the teacher, which since it is an actor debate and we're only talking about the teacher and their incentives, if the teacher actually gives an unfair advantage to a person who belongs from the same tribe or from the same disadvantaged background, since they're inherently inclined to that particular individual or group of students, this will actually discriminate all the people who are not from that group. And therefore, rather it be a white person, rather it be anyone else, this is the idea of discrimination that we've been putting forward throughout the debate, and is something which they try to unfairly burden upon us, however it is put down. But then they also need to realize that the spectrum of this debate is an actor debate. They need to realize that they have to talk about the incentives of the teacher. Repeatedly talk about Obama being a president, however they do not realize that we're not supporting the state being doing that. What we're actually advocating for is that the teacher would not even want to do that for their students in the first place. But then moving on to my three clashes throughout the debate, I believe that the first class being that where are the students better off, second being what does the teacher actually want, and third being where is the present and the future of these students better off. Before I even start to talk about that, you need to know that when you're talking about the merit of meritocracy, they are discriminated by society because of two reasons, which we've already provided you as well in the debate, being racism and infantilization, which they're already receiving. So they don't want, the teacher themselves do not want to infantilize the black children and reward them unfairly because you think that they're intellectually less capable. They require these unfair leverages upon others because they're not capable to do this. They are not able to climb upon the societal ladder upon themselves, because they know that when these children will then step into society, there will be no one for them to back them up or to unfairly advantage them, and they will have to face more intensified discrimination. As a result, the teacher would not want that in the first place. But then secondly, when they're talking about racism, they're now discriminating against these white children or all the other groups of children as well. That means that the teacher would always be bothered by the fact that they pointed the ideas of racism against a child based upon their skin color upon by themselves as well, which is something that they try to negate. But then also talking about where are these students better off, when you talk about their career, how it will be better on their end, it is not better, because when you're talking about a proposition, there is no guaranteed career to them. Why is that so? That is because, as we've already established that in the debate, external examinations, for example SAT, for example NET, for example CIs, or even university applications, they already do characterize this in the debate that the students at stake are the ones who are impressionable. That is to say that they're in their primary levels of education. Therefore, when they will actually, this is the teacher who might be one of their class teachers. That is to say, when these people actually get out of these schools, they actually then go to colleges or graduate from thereupon as well, they won't have the support of this teacher to do so. That is to say that now they might have become complacent as well, as we've already discussed that in the argument by my second speaker, and therefore they won't be able to succeed in life by their own efforts as well. But they also then talk about how they face a lot of bullying, although they do not tell us how by improving the marks or inflating the grades of these individuals will actually translate into solving these issues at stake. Yet it only actually creates more segregation, more discrimination for these children, since you're alienating them more. They also try to push this narrative that, you're actually inflating the grades of a person, no one will notice that, since it's a very believable increase. However, it is actually very intuitive to think of a thing that a group of community is actually studying at a school, they're not scoring good, and then suddenly a teacher arrives who are from the same background, and then they have aspiring results, they are actually improving. They also do need to realize when they talk about the accountability that it will not exist on their end. They do need to realize that yes, it does exist, because these teachers, they have these unique contract with the schools. There are checkups on the academic performance or the progress of these individuals, as well as the changes in the examination reports. All these things are analyzed. From all these things, it can be deduced that a person is being advantaged over the other, as well as from all the peer competition that exists within the classroom as well. It can always be very prominently noticed by all the other individuals as well about the unfair advantage that one group of people is receiving. But then we talk about the principle of complacency. When they're talking, moving to my second class, about where their future is better, we do need to realize that their future is more protected at op. Why is that so? Because at prop, when you're giving these advantages to the students, these leverages to the students, you're not only making them actually discriminate around other groups as well, but you're also creating problems within their own communities. That is to say that students who are actually deserving within these areas are also advantaged, because the same people from their same area are scoring well as well, just because they belong to that particular area. And they might become complacent that, oh, they don't need to work hard. Why is that so? Because, oh, I belong from that particular area, so I will be advantaged over the other and will get the leverage to actually do so and climb the ladder. This is how bad it is. They also repeatedly talk about how movements take a lot of people from IVY leagues. However, they need to talk about as well that IVY leagues as well, these are all the applications which do require external examinations. In these examinations, these teachers will not be there. And then secondly, talking about more about why the teacher would not want to do that. That is because when you're talking about these underprivileged areas, you need to know that there is already sensitive stigma revolving around the students from these areas. And the teacher would not want that this stigma is further intensified. Why is that so? Because people would then raise concerns about their intellectual capacity and they will be further infantilized. And as a result, they would not achieve goals in their life. And this is not something that the teacher would want. But then moving on to my third class as well, they talk about how this is moral uprightness. However, you need to know that morality must exist in all spectrums. However, when you're trying to resolve the discrimination, which is also not rightfully being done, so you're actually discriminating another group of individuals. Thus, this backfires the intended implications which the prop tried to put up and burdens on the opposition. But then they secondly talk about how the teacher would want to appreciate these children. You need to realize that alienation and segregation or discrimination of these individuals would further intensified at prop when they will be advantaged, when this will actually create a group of these people that, oh, you belong from that particular area, so you will fall on that particular area or criteria of marking just because you belong to that area. They also talk about how everyone deserves equal things. However, they never give you any mechanism for how equality exists on their end. You're unfairly advantaging some kids over the other. Then they also mention the drug abuse, which is exactly which adds on to our case. When you're talking about drug abuse, concerns like this already revolves around people from these communities. When you're going to unfairly advantage them, this will further intensify these concerns. This will actually intensify the stigma around them, which is why they won't be successful in their future. But then when we weigh this debate, panel, it is imperative to understand that the principle of education outweighs the principle of reparation, since that is more universal than the small minutiae of circumstance. And we're co-opting this issue at op by our own principles, by giving them a fair start at life, more resources in the future, more benefits and more returns, which we can actually avail in the future by being less reliant upon their teachers to just increase their marks magically. Therefore, by being the side which actually gives you alternatives, gives you the incentives of the teacher, and actually gives you analytical depth, we believe that this debate should go to opposition.
Thank you so much for this speech. Now I invite upon opposition reply.
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I love how very conveniently in third prop speech they set up a criteria for us to win this debate, which I'll show to you we've already fulfilled. Their idea was that because you feel a sense of loyalty to your community, you want to fulfill that sense of loyalty. Now, panel, if I flip this on its head and I tell you that we fulfill this sense of loyalty much better on our side of the house, I think empirically and arbitrarily we take this debate instantly. Why then do we fulfill this sense of loyalty to your community on our side of the house? Firstly, because very simply we told you that because these teachers generally care for these children, what's going to happen is that they want to give them a fair representation of what life's going to look like, and then also prepare these children to deal with that sort of environment when they actually go out into mainstream society. What do I mean by this? I think that these children that we're talking about here will be discriminated against largely when they go out into mainstream society. At that point in time, giving them because of racism and things like classism which already exist, at that point in time, as a teacher from that same community, when you give these children a false hope through this idea of inflated grade, that's going to this idea on of inflation in terms of grades, that's going to be extremely disastrous. Why so? Firstly, because these children will then become complacent, and they will expect that from general mainstream society as well. They will expect people to respect their their extremely lazy views toward work life, and that's going to backfire, because no, the rest of mainstream society is not like this wonderful black teacher that proposition paints it out to be. But secondly, they will always be dependent on external help to achieve the smallest amount of changes within society. And when they don't get that, at that point in time panel, it takes only just one black teacher to come out who wants to treat these children fairly, instead of inflating their grades artificially, to wreck their sense of life, to wreck their sense of hope, because you were at this platform now, but now that another teacher from the same community has come about, and you were expecting the same sort of advantaged treatment from them, but they treated you to a grade level that you actually deserve, which is to say, here now it's going to wreck your identity, because all of the sense of hope you built at proposition, the sense of hard work because people believe in you built at proposition, is going to disappear. And thirdly, because you generally will think that society is out to get you, and as a vulnerable actor in this debate, that's never going to help you break the quote unquote cycle of poverty that proposition loves to talk about within this debate. But then, very importantly, an idea that I brought to you at second, still not dealt with. This is an actor debate. As long as the actor does not care about the principle that proposition brings to you, it does not matter whatever relevant benefits they bring you, because there is a dissonance between the argumentation and the end actor. But lastly, then, on the idea of stereotypes. Panel, I think this was extremely nice argumentation from myself. However, it was not refuted at all. Why do I think this is extremely important in winning this debate? I think proposition, to a large extent, concedes to this idea that you will eventually get found out, but there is only a time lag when you get found out. Now, if you do get found out, which you will, what's going to happen is that stereotypes which already exist against these very vulnerable communities within status quo. For example, these minorities are sucking up all of our resources. They're taking out all of the money that we deserve. They're taking the rightful grades that we deserve, and they don't even deserve it. They're cheats in and of themselves. All of these stereotypes are suddenly validated, especially within the classroom full of 25 white children and 3 black children, 2 Latino kids. At that point in time, panel, we think that you're going to disproportionately harm these very children you care so much about, because you owe them a sense of loyalty through community. At that point in time, panel, we think we take this debate very clearly.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now I invite Pawan Gaur to reply the last speaker.
Can I start? About half of side opposition's argumentation and responses are almost entirely assertive. And not once in any of their speeches do they actually directly engage with any of our argumentation. So as long as I rebuild our argumentation and prove that their rebuttals don't necessarily work, I think that we clearly take this debate. But there's generally 3 main issues when this debate. Firstly, regarding whether or not the teacher will generally get caught. Secondly, regarding fairness. And thirdly, about whether or not we're even benefiting a child in the first place. Firstly, regarding whether or not the teacher will get caught. We give you two main ideas here. Firstly, we told you that you're only improving a child from subpar to par, so most likely people wouldn't necessarily notice. And secondly, that's extremely difficult to track when you've inflated some degree of grades, because you're inflating these grades before you actually input them into a spreadsheet, for example, in the first place. Their only response to this was that people will still notice, which notice how, firstly, there's nothing to qualify this, and it's extremely assertive. But secondly, even if I concede to this idea, the problem is that if people do end up noticing the improvement that's been brought about within the grades of these people, what's more likely is that people will allocate this to the child's improvement rather than the teacher's malintent in the first place, because that's the more likely thing that's going to take place in society as a whole. Because you generally do recognize that people do change over time and that they do generally improve. And as a result of that, they're more likely to allocate to the child's improvement because that's something that's more common in society in comparison to a teacher inflating grades. But like on a general comparative, even if you concede to all of their ideas, why are we still like winning this issue? The problem here is that even if these people like notice or you do get caught, the thing is the school won't necessarily care that much. And this is something that they've basically characterized out for us in the first place, because at the point when they argue that there's only a very small amount of people inside of his school that this debate is actually about, I'm not necessarily sure why the school would care so much about you inflating these grades. But then secondly, sure, it's important. Sure, the person might value themselves as more important. And even if there is like an extremely detrimental impact, the reason he values the child a lot more than the job, and it's something we told you at third, which is in direct response to the refutation at second, we told you that you form communities around a lot of people. So that is to say, since you face this form of discrimination in the past, you're going to form a community with the people that are also facing this discrimination in the status quo as well. And especially because you recognize that these are children who are currently facing this discrimination. This is something you've already passed through, and you've already passed through this. And as a result of that, you need to protect them a lot more than you need to protect yourself because you've already made it past these barriers in the first place. Then the second issue about fairness, and this is actually a short issue because they basically don't deal with any of our ideas about how you need to bring them up to a level playing field and about how you have an incentive as a result of this idea of community. The only idea here was that white people would be discriminated against. The problem here is that firstly, since they don't deal with our case, all of our ideas are still generally standing. But secondly, on a comparative, let's do a stakeholder analysis here. Firstly, we're catering to the more vulnerable stakeholder in the status quo. But secondly, this stakeholder also generally matters a lot more to the teacher in comparison to these white children in the first place because they have a sense of community with these ethnic minorities as a whole. But then the last issue regarding whether or not you're actually benefiting the child, we told you that you're breaking through these labels, and secondly, the grades are generally important because grade transcripts are something that's looked at when you're going into higher education. And this again something they don't necessarily deal with. Their only argumentation here was that you become extremely complacent. And we told you that the complacency only happens when there's an overwhelming amount of success for an extremely long amount of time. The reason this is more likely to act as motivation on our side is because these ethnic minorities recognize that they have to take advantage of every single small benefit that they get in the first place because they are generally discriminated against in society. So as a result of that, they're more likely to take advantage of this by working harder in the first place. But then on a comparative, why do we still take this debate why do we still take this issue even if we can see that people will become complacent? The reason we still win this issue is because higher education institutions will still look at your grades within the school before accepting you into like a university or something in the first place. So at that point, you're still breaking through these barriers. Since I've proven to you why we're generally being more charitable in our engagement, since you're not engaging with any of our ideas and how we have a better characterization, I think that we clearly take this debate.
Thank you so much for this speech and this round as a whole. You guys can return back to the main meeting. You guys will get the decision in the main hall. Thank you so much for a wonderful debate.